You've spoken quite often on how you have used predictive data analytics in the development of your human capital strategy. What if I were a company that wanted to start adopting that within HR, what are your suggestions for how I would go about that?
Well, I would start it the same way we did.
Mm-hmm.
We picked a skill.
Mm-hmm.
And because again, you can't boil the ocean, right? And the good thing about this is once you kind of have a methodology in place, you can replicate it, expand it, drive it deeper into the organization. So when I have spoken on this, that's a common question. Hey, gee, how do you start? We don't have a whole department like you do now, and the answer is I didn't either when we started. So we picked a skill. In the case of our business, a critical skill in our business is systems engineers, right? And they come in two flavors. There's the IT kind, but then there's the kind that an airplane or a tank is a big system, which has lots of things that have to be integrated together. So systems engineers, do that kind of thinking and planning, and it seems like magic to me, but they figure all that out. And the other thing about systems engineers is you don't come out of college as a systems engineer. It's a critical skill for us, but it's also one that you have to build over time, which is why we picked it. So we picked one skill that was big enough in the organization to where the data would be statistically meaningful. It was critical to all three of our sectors that their part of their strategy was going to be underpinned by having that skill. And we knew from the internal just looking at the regular old demographics that any HR person would have, it's like, well, that's getting to be an older workforce. So if we know nothing else, we know that the retirements are going to increase. And so there's going to be, even at that rudimentary level, a gap. The next step after you pick a skill is look at what data do you have about those people, and this is the grinded out part. Name by name, what do we know about these people? Their age, how long have they been here? Where did they come from? What's their background, so that we can start to build a model about what's going to happen.
Did you map that also into their performance, right? So you could then start tracking where they came up in terms of their experiences and where they ranked in terms of performance relative to each other. Did you make that connection at this point in time?
Not at this point in time.
Okay.
As you move down the kind of the maturity curve of human capital planning maturity, you start to then pull in those kind of more subtle differentiators. So what we started with, like I said, was just raw, kind of the basic data that said, ooh, we're going to have a problem here because we're going to start running out of these folks. And so we did to answer your question about, well, what would you do if you're going to start this? Here's what we did. So we took that group of people, and in analyzing each of them, we kind of put them into 4 buckets. They're an IT kind of engineer, they're a systems engineer that works on platforms, they're different kind of systems engineers. So we said, now let's look at those 4 buckets. And we took the prior 2 years worth of data. Who stayed, who left, who performed well, who didn't perform well. And we brought in all of the systems engineering managers, and we said, what will affect whether these people stay or go? And they developed a set of 200 and some hypotheses. Well, it could be anything from what's their commute distance, to it's that.
Especially in Washington.
Right, exactly. And it's those kinds of things, like what affects somebody staying or going. Now we looked at our employee survey data, and that kind of gave some indicators of things we should look at. But it really got to some pretty specific things. Some are obvious, like, well, what's the quality of their supervisor? Where did they come from? Now there's things we didn't know, like their life events, because we don't have that data. But from those, we distilled those down to a set of I think 12 or 15 that we could start to model statistically.
Right.
And then we took the prior 2 years' data and we ran the correlations. And what we found was, each of the groupings was right because they all behaved a little differently. But we got this very discrete set of predictors, what we thought were predictors. So we'd taken the 2 years worth of data, run the model and said, hey, these appear correlated with who had left and who had stayed over those 2 years. And we said, let's see if it predicts what's going to happen this year. And in the best, and this is pretty extreme, in one of the groups, we were 98% right. That if we said Jane Scott is leaving this year, she left. The worst we did was 76% right with that group, which means we'd said, hey, we've really triggered something. Now, it's limited, right? Because that was a pretty limited time horizon. We could tell next year, what was going to happen next year. Well, you can imagine, the organization just thought that was fantastic, right? I mean, they're like,
you take a lot of the volatility out of the what if and the decision making of the corporate strategy, right? I mean, because you have brought in that high degree of certainty in terms of what your predictions are.
Well, even more important than that, you can do something about it.
Yeah.
Because if we said, hey, this is a critical skill, and among that population of critically skilled people, these are really the superstars. These are the future leaders. These are the top technologists, that kind of thing. And if you see that they are a flight risk based on the predictive model, you can intervene. Because a prediction doesn't have to be reality. And so from the standpoint of being able to then engage with management and say, hey, Jane Scott's one of your key performers, and we predict that if you don't do something about her commute, she's probably going to leave. And so you can have a conversation with Jane Scott and say, you're one of our top performers. What could we do? We noticed that you have a 45-minute drive to work. What if we had you work from home for a couple days? Or what if we had you work at facility X, instead of Y? You can do something about it. It's not just that from a planning standpoint you have more clarity, but from a talent standpoint, you can intervene.
I think that's such a critical way to look at things. Is sort of what would it take? You're basically asking your employees, I have targeted you, I want you to stay. What would it take? And I think that even just having that switch in mindset, if you will, in terms of how valuable your talent is to achieving your corporate strategy, achieving your corporate goals. I've done a lot of analytics. I care about who you are. I care about what you're going to become. And what would it take for you to continue with BAE? Or what would it take for me to show you the door? Right? For the ones that you don't want. Right?
No, that's exactly right. And so if you think about it, like back to your fundamental question was, so how would you, how do you start down this path? Pick a skill, look at the data you have, take some data over time on that critical skill, and then use it and develop some hypotheses, and then test to see whether you're right or wrong. It's a scientific, it's a laboratory model, right? Scientists do that all the time. Develop some hypotheses, test your hypotheses. Even the hypotheses that fail told you something. And so that's what's really exciting about it. And then once you kind of have your model of doing it, well, you start to say, you engage with the businesses. Okay, we did one critical skill. Let's talk about more. The way we did it, we started really simply. After we did this systems engineering test, each sector, pick a critical skill, and let's do a workforce plan for that skill. And stretch it out over time so that it fits. We plan on 5-year horizons, so we modeled that over a 5-year horizon. And then we've just continued to increase. One of the businesses now is up to 13 or 15 critical skills. So that's a pretty robust plan. The other good thing is you don't have to do it for everything, right? I mean, what makes your business work? What's going to make your business work? Start there. And that's the approach that we've taken. And like I said, it's kind of culminated this year in the actual guidance, from the corporation to our businesses is when you are preparing your IBP, you'll talk about technology, customers, investments, and the human capital necessary to execute this plan. And so, that's,
well, that's not the first
puts
time
it
that
back in the, puts
Yes.
it, it really puts it, in the forefront of the strategy, just
Right.
like every other critical component of any business's strategy.